Religion, the belief in an afterlife, the foundation of many a moral compass, something that brings strangers together or causes a great divide. Wars have been fought in the name of God, trials to be overcome, love for your fellow man. Religion has shaped cultures across continents, united people for a common cause, yet great repercussions, unexpected consequences left in the wake of religious movements. Welcome to Let's Get Foxy, episode 2 of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. I am your brain-challenged host, Lacey. Laugh. Please laugh. Just because I've had a couple setbacks doesn't mean we can't laugh, as my brain literally overreacts and has me riding a little bit of a roller coaster right now. Your girl is just a little dizzy. For today's episode, we are going to cover chapters 4 through 10 of Moby Dick, and our discussion is on the importance of religion during this time, the 19th century. This period of time, specifically 1790s to sometime in the 1840s, was known as the Second Great Awakening. This is a time where there was a huge religious revival in the United States. It's a time of great religious freedom, as Protestantism became the largest religious sect in the States. There were many branches of Protestantism. There were the Episcopalians, who were the most traditional with their bishops, preachers, and parishes. There were the Methodists, who also had bishops, but they didn't have preachers and parishes. Baptists and Congregationalists were considered the most radical, as they didn't have a specific hierarchy to oversee the beliefs and practices. Presbyterians were very similar to Episcopalians, where they used the pyramid for their clergy authority. However, theirs was built from the bottom up instead of the top down. And with all of these different sects, there came to be differences among the Protestant beliefs regarding Christ's role and his influence. So for many of the sects, they believed that Christ was the Son of God and therefore God himself. And they believed quite heavily in the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Unitarians, on the other hand, believed that God was a single being, and Jesus was a perfect man. Many believed that the crucifixion of Christ was the most important in his life, as it was considered the act of salvation. He died for humanity, and thus the atonement was possible. The Unitarians, however, focused on Christ's teachings to form moral laws. And then there were a few others that looked at Christ's life and believed that to be God's love, that love is the way to live. And among these differences of opinion, there became to be differences in how one could be saved from damnation. So your Episcopalians, Methodists, and some Baptists believed that God intended for all of humanity to be saved. This belief is going to come into play a little bit later as we discuss another topic, but something that's really important to know is this belief that God intended for all humanity to be saved differs from an earlier belief that God only intended a select few to be saved, that God knew which few were to be saved when they were sent to this earth, and you could tell in the way that they lived their lives. Some other differences of opinion that rose among the different religions is how sin is to be wiped from the earth. So many believed that the end of the world is going to have this cataclysmic event where it's going to wipe all the sinners away and leave the righteous. There are others where they believed that sin was to be defeated before Christ could return. And in order to defeat sin, you had to live without sin. You had to live righteously. And we're going to take a brief pause on the genuine religious aspect, and we're going to talk real quick about land expansion in the United States, because it actually affected the religions. So during this time frame, there was much expansion. Our country was growing. So in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase happened and we gained lots of land. And then only 45 years later, in 1848, we obtained more territory from Mexico. So this expansion made it so that we went from just being a coastal country to a coast-to-coast country. And so it encouraged what they call expansion. So people started moving west. So this westward movement helped to reinvigorate something that preachers were already doing, where they were traveling across the countryside with sermons. And their sermons in this case were focused on human will and a more loving God. And to elaborate, this is known as the evangelical movement, or some just call it the Protestant movement, where they believed that they must expand God's kingdom. So I found a quote that I thought helped illuminate this well. So Dr. Graham Warder wrote in the Virginia Commonwealth University Library Social Welfare History Project, only free individuals, they believed, could freely choose God. So within this movement, they're working to expand God's kingdom. They believed that it was their duty to convert others, to help bring them to God. That way they could choose God. And this belief actually helped influence the movement across the United States. It actually had influence on government officials and the settlers. So you remember our preachers from earlier? They began to preach about repentance, repenting of your sins, and embracing God. And in doing so, they were doing a lot of preaching of the promise of salvation and the threat of damnation and how it was the end of times. The end of times is just around the corner. And they had this great push to convert others to their beliefs because they believed that conversion played a pivotal role in preparing for Christ's second coming. And that being said, there were many other religions, many other sects, many other beliefs that began cropping up during this time. And some of these movements actually moved with the expanding frontier because they were challenging societal and religious norms, and it was being met with backlash, so they ended up moving. And so the most famous of these examples is Joseph Smith with the LDS Church, commonly known as Mormon, and his successor, Brigham Young. They ended up moving west and then settling in modern-day Utah. So it gave them a place to live and not be bothered, for them to grow as their religion there. That being said, if we return back to conversion and getting more people in the religion to choose God, women actually became key to these movements. They helped to gather support. And I know that you're like, what do you mean women? Women didn't play a role in religion. Why are you mentioning women? Well, in this case, women actually played a greater role than you would expect. And so a woman would join the church, or her family would join, and then she would get the extended family or her friends. And so it caused this great movement, this chain reaction within religion. The women also helped influence different societies that were formed that were endorsed by both the religion and the government. So these societies were created to address issues, to correct society, and expand God's kingdom at the same time. Some of these societies were to abolish slavery, education, prison reform, and more. And so converting then turned into a global mission. So missionaries became a thing where they were actually endorsed again by the church and state, where these people believed that you had to adopt Christian values and beliefs in order to be saved. And so what it began with is they were working on converting the Native Americans within our country, because again, we just became coast to coast. So we were pushing out the Native Americans. We were trying to, well, I say we, but they were trying to, and I say this in air quotes, civilize them. So they would send these missionaries out And they weren't allowed to hold on to any part of their culture. They were forced to dress differently, do their hair differently, cook differently. They weren't even allowed to do food the way that they had. They were all forced to do the farming and animal husbandry and things that Christians consider to be the norm, accepted by God. It didn't just end with the country. It didn't just end with the United States. They ended up sending missionaries to the island peoples and other countries. And I genuinely believe that they believed in what they did, that their motivations had good intentions. But we're able to look at history and see this huge repercussion on indigenous communities. So many parts of the cultures were lost. So many people died. So it was so harmful for them because of the way that they did it. It just wasn't right. And as I was researching about religion, because this is all stuff that I had known before, I actually found something that I didn't know and I thought was really interesting and kind of appalled me, to be honest. But religions actually had an influence on slavery. Who knew, right? So, before the 1830s, Protestants had declared slavery immoral. They were against slavery. People needed to be freed. They needed to be allowed to live their lives. However, this rhetoric had changed by the 1850s. The clergy's opinion had changed. Slavery is now compatible and, dare I say, necessary for the faith? Like, what? So they believed that slavery provided the Christians an opportunity to show their Christian responsibilities to inferiors and to help these inferiors develop proper virtues. And I hope that you can hear the sarcasm and the air quotes that I got going on, because how ridiculous is that? But it's something that they believed. It's something that they preached, and so other people believed it. This belief was so ingrained because I don't know how to adequately help you to understand, but religion was core to life back then. Everything centered around religion. It was the driving force in life back then. They didn't have access to all the information that we do today. They didn't know many things. Books were scarce. There weren't very many things that they could go and look at for resources. They didn't have easy access to people who, with these other beliefs in themselves. What they had was the Bible. What they had was their religion. And it was the driving force for life. And it was the most important thing. Everything centered around religion. And it caused people to again lose parts of their culture. However, in 1865, yes, the 13th Amendment declares slavery unconstitutional. Hallelujah! However, the clergy were now faced with a new dilemma. Do they change their teachings again? Because if you look at the time frame, it was a short amount of time where they went from slavery is immoral, slavery is not okay, to slavery is okay, it's compatible with the faith, because it allows us to show our good Christian morals, our good Christian values, and it allows us to share it with others. To now, it's unconstitutional. Do they revamp those teachings? Or what do they do? So I actually am going to leave that thought with you, as my head does hurt. Religion is one of those very complicated things that you've got to find ways to explain without being too over the top and still be respectful. And so we're actually going to turn our attention to Moby Dick and a whale of a sermon. So stay tuned for after the reading, because we're going to do some literary analysis. And if you haven't already, follow me on Patreon. You get access to everything first. Before our book reading begins, I just wanted to take a minute to say this book is a snapshot of the past. This book may contain negative views and/or treatment of people and cultures. This was wrong then, and it is wrong now. Instead of blacklisting these novels, let's recognize the influence and learn from it. For, as the philosopher George Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Let's learn from the past to create a more inclusive future together. Chapter 4, The Counterpane. Upon waking next morning about daylight, I found Queequeg's arm thrown over me in the most loving and affectionate manner. You had almost thought I had been his wife. The counterpane was of patchwork, full of odd little party-colored squares and triangles, and this arm of his tattooed all over with an interminable, Cretan labyrinth of a figure, no two parts of which were of one precise shade, owing, I suppose, to his keeping his arm at sea, unmethodically in sun and shade, his shirt sleeves irregularly rolled up at various times. This same arm of his, I say, looked for all the world like a strip of that same patchwork quilt. Indeed, partly lying on it, as the arm did when I first awoke, I could hardly tell it from the quilt. They so blended their hues together, and it was only by the sense of weight and pressure that I could tell that Queequeg was hugging me. My sensations were strange. Let me try to explain them. When I was a child, I well remember a somewhat similar circumstance that befell me. Whether it was a reality or a dream, I never could entirely settle. The circumstance was this. I had been cutting up some caper or other. I think it was trying to crawl up the chimney, as I had seen a little sweep do a few days previous. And my stepmother, who, somehow or other, was all the time whipping me, or sending me to bed supperless. My mother dragged me by the legs out of the chimney and packed me off to bed, though it was only 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 21st June, the longest day in the year in our hemisphere. I felt dreadfully, but there was no help for it. So upstairs I went to my little room in the 3rd floor, undressed myself as slowly as possible so as to kill time, and with a bitter sigh got between the sheets. I lay there dismally calculating that 16 entire hours must elapse before I could hope for a resurrection. 16 hours in bed! The small of my back ached to think of it. And it was so light, too, the sun shining in at the window, and a great rattling of coaches in the streets, and the sound of gay voices all over the house. I felt worse and worse. At last I got up, dressed, and softly going down in my stockinged feet, sought out my stepmother, and suddenly threw myself at her feet, beseeching her as a particular favor to give me a good slippering for my misbehavior. Anything indeed but condemning me to lie abed such an unendurable length of time. But she was the best and most conscientious of stepmothers, and back I had to go to my room. For several hours I lay there broad awake, feeling a great deal worse than I have ever done since, even from the greatest subsequent misfortunes. At last I must have fallen into a troubled nightmare of a doze, and slowly waking from it, half steeped in dreams, I opened my eyes, and the before sunlit room was now wrapped in outer darkness. Instantly I felt a shock running through all my frame. Nothing was to be seen, and nothing was to be heard. But a supernatural hand seemed placed in mine. My arm hung over the counterpane, and the nameless, unimaginable, silent form or phantom to which the hand belonged seemed closely seated by my bedside. For what seemed ages piled on ages, I lay there, frozen with the most awful fears, not daring to drag away my hand, yet ever thinking that if I could but stir it 1 single inch, the horrid spell would be broken. I knew not how this consciousness at last glided away from me, but waking in the morning I shudderingly remembered it all, and for days and weeks and months afterwards I lost myself in confounding attempts to explain the mystery. Nay, to this very hour I often puzzle myself with it. Now, take away the awful fear, and my sensations at feeling the supernatural hand in mine were very similar in their strangeness to those which I experienced on waking up and seeing Queequeg's pagan arm thrown round me. But at length all the past night's events soberly recurred, one by one, in fixed reality, and then I lay only alive to the comical predicament. For though I tried to move his arm, unlock his bridegroom clasp, yet sleeping as he was, he still hugged me tightly, as though naught but death should part us twain. I now strove to rouse him, "Queequeg!" but his only answer was a snore. I then rolled over, my neck feeling as if it were in a horse collar, and suddenly felt a slight scratch. Throwing aside the counterpane, there lay the tomahawk sleeping by the savage's side, as if it were a hatchet-faced baby. A pretty pickle, truly, thought I. A bed here in a strange house in the broad day, with a cannibal and a tomahawk? Queequeg! In the name of goodness, Queequeg, wake! At length, by dint of much wriggling and loud and incessant expostulations upon the unbecomingness of his hugging a fellow male in that matrimonial sort of style, I succeeded in extracting a grunt, and presently he drew back his arm, shook himself all over like a Newfoundland dog, just from the water, and sat up in bed, stiff as a pikestaff, looking at me, and rubbing his eyes as if he did not altogether remember how I came to be there, though a dim consciousness of knowing something about me seemed to slowly dawning over him. Meanwhile I lay quietly eyeing him, having no serious misgivings now, and bent upon narrowly observing so curious a creature. When at last his mind seemed made up touching the character of his bedfellow, and he became, as it were, reconciled to the fact, he jumped out upon the floor, and by certain signs and sounds he gave me to understand that, if it pleased me, he would dress first, and then leave me to dress afterwards, leaving the whole apartment to myself. Thinks I, Queequeg, under the circumstances, this is a very civilized overture. But the truth is, these savages have an innate sense of delicacy. Say what you will, it is marvelous how essentially polite they are. I pay this particular compliment to Queequeg, because he treated me with so much civility and consideration, while I was guilty of great rudeness, staring at him from the bed, and watching all his toilet motions, for the time my curiosity getting the better of my breeding. Nevertheless, a man like Queequeg you don't see every day. He and his ways were well worth unusual regarding. He commenced dressing at top by donning his beaver hat, a very tall one by the by, and then still minus his trousers he hunted up his boots. What under the heavens he did it for, I cannot tell. But his next movement was to crush himself, boots in hand and hat on, under the bed, when from sundry violent gaspings and strainings, I inferred he was hard at work, booting himself, though by no law of propriety that I ever heard of, is any man required to be private when putting on his boots. But Queequeg, do you see, was a creature in the transition stage, neither caterpillar nor butterfly. He was just enough civilized to show off his outlandishness in the strangest possible manners. His education was not yet completed. He was an undergraduate. If he had not been a small degree civilized, he very probably would not have troubled himself with boots at all. But then, if he had not been still a savage, he never would have dreamt of getting under the bed to put them on. At last he emerged with his hat very much dented and crushed down over his eyes, and began creaking and limping about the room, as if not being much accustomed to boots. His pair of damp, wrinkled, cowhide ones, probably not made to order either, rather pinched and tormented him at the first go-off of a bitter cold morning. Seeing now that there were no curtains to the window, and that the street being very narrow, the house opposite commanded a plain view into the room, and observing more and more the indecorous figure that Queequeg made, staving about with little else but his hat and boots on, I begged him as well as I could to accelerate his toilet somewhat, and particularly to get into his pantaloons as soon as possible. He complied, and then proceeded to wash himself. At that time in the morning, any Christian would have washed his face, but Queequeg, to my amazement, contented himself with restricting his ablutions to his chest, arms, and hands. He then donned his waistcoat, and taking up a piece of hard soap on the washstand table, dipped it into water and commenced lathering his face. I was watching to see where he kept his razor, when lo and behold he takes the harpoon from the bed corner, slips out the long wooden stock, unsheaths the head, wets it a little on his boot, and striding up to the bit of mirror against the wall, begins a vigorous scraping, or rather harpooning of his cheeks. Thinks I, Queequeg, this is using Roger's best cutlery, with a vengeance. Afterwards I wondered the less at this operation when I came to know of what fine steel the head of a harpoon is made, and how exceedingly sharp the long straight edges are always kept. The rest of his toilet was soon achieved, and he proudly marched out of the room, wrapped up in his great pilot monkey jacket, and sporting his harpoon like a marshal's baton. Chapter 5. Breakfast. I quickly followed suit, and descending into the bar-room accosted the grinning landlord very pleasantly. I cherished no malice towards him, though he had been skylarking with me not a little in the matter of my bedfellow. However, a good laugh is a mighty good thing, and rather too scarce a good thing, the more's the pity. So if any one man in his own proper person afford stuff for a good joke to anybody, let him not be backward, but let him cheerfully allow himself to spend and be spent in that way. And the man that has anything bountifully laughable about him, be sure there is more in that man than you perhaps think for. The bar-room was now full of the boarders who had been dropping in the night previous, and whom I had not as yet had a good look at. They were nearly all whalemen, chief mates and second mates and third mates, and sea carpenters and sea coopers and sea blacksmiths and harpooners, and shipkeepers, a brown and brawny company with bosky beards, an unshorn, shaggy set, all wearing monkey jackets for morning gowns. You could pretty plainly tell how long each one had been ashore. This young fellow's healthy cheek is like a sun-toasted pear in hue, and would seem to smell almost as musky. He cannot have been 3 days landed from his Indian voyage. That man next to him looks a few shades lighter. You might say a touch of satinwood is in him. In the complexion of a third still lingers a tropic tawn, but slightly bleached withal. He doubtless has tarried whole weeks ashore, but who could show a cheek like Queequeg, which, barred with various tints, seemed like the Andes' western slope, to show forth in one array contrasting climates, zone by zone. "Grub ho!" now cried the landlord, flinging open a door, and in we went to breakfast. They say that men who have seen the world thereby become quite at ease in manner, quite self-possessed in company. Not always, though. Ledyard, the great New England traveller, and Mungo Park, the Scotch one, of all men they possessed the least assurance in the parlour. But perhaps the mere crossing of Siberia in a sledge drawn by dogs as Ledyard did, or the taking a long solitary walk on an empty stomach in the negro heart of Africa, which was the sum of poor Mungo's performances. This kind of travel, I say, may not be the very best mode of attaining a high social polish. Still, for the most part, that sort of thing is to be had anywhere. These reflections just here are occasioned by the circumstance that after we were all seated at the table, and I was preparing to hear some good stories about whaling, to my no small surprise, nearly every man maintained a profound silence. And not only that, but they looked embarrassed. Yes, here were a set of sea dogs, many of whom, without the slightest bashfulness, had boarded great whales on high seas, entire strangers to them, and duelled them dead without winking. And yet here they sat at a social breakfast table, all of the same calling, all of kindred tastes, looking round as sheepishly at each other as though they had never been out of sight of some sheepfold among the Green Mountains. A curious sight, these bashful bears, these timid warrior whalemen. But as for Queequeg, why, Queequeg sat there among them, at the head of the table, too, it so chanced, as cool as an icicle. To be sure, I cannot say much for his breeding. His greatest admirer could not have cordially justified his bringing his harpoon into breakfast with him, and using it there without ceremony, reaching over the table with it to the eminent jeopardy of many heads, and grappling the beefsteaks towards him. But that was certainly very coolly done by him, and everyone knows that in most people's estimation, to do anything coolly is to do it genteelly. We will not speak of all Queequeg's peculiarities here, how he eschewed coffee and hot rolls, and applied his undivided attention to beefsteaks, done rare. Enough that when breakfast was over, he withdrew, like the rest, into the public room, lighted his tomahawk pipe, and was sitting there quietly digesting and smoking with his inseparable hat on, when I sallied out for a stroll. Chapter 6. The Street. If I had been astonished at first, catching a glimpse of so outlandish an individual as Queequeg circulating among the polite society of a civilized town, that astonishment soon departed upon taking my first daylight stroll through the streets of New Bedford. In thoroughfares nigh the docks, any considerable seaport will frequently offer to view the queerest-looking nondescripts from foreign parts. Even in Broadway and Chestnut streets, Mediterranean mariners will sometimes jostle the affrighted ladies. Regent Street is not unknown to Lascars and Malays, And at Bombay in the Apollo Green live Yankees, have often scared the natives. But New Bedford beats all Water Street and Wapping. In these last mentioned haunts you see only sailors, but in New Bedford actual cannibals stand chatting at street corners. Savages outright, many of whom yet carry on their bones unholy flesh. It makes a stranger stare. But, besides the Fijians, Tonga-Tabouers, Arromangians, Panangians, and Bergians, and besides the wild specimens of the whaling craft, which unheeded reel about the streets, you will see other sights still more curious, certainly more comical. There weekly arrive in this town scores of green Vermonters and New Hampshire men, all athirst for gain and glory in the fishery. They are mostly young, of stalwart frames, fellows who have felled forests, and now seek to drop the axe and snatch the whale lance. Many are as green as the green mountains whence they came. In some things you would think them but a few hours old. Look there! That chap strutting round the corner. He wears a beaver hat and swallow-tailed coat, girdled with a sailor belt and sheath knife. Here comes another with a sou'wester and a bombazine cloak. No town-bred dandy will compare with a country-bred one. I mean a downright bumpkin dandy. A fellow that in the dog days will mow his 2 acres in buckskin gloves for fear of tanning his hands. Now, when a country dandy like this takes it into his head to make a distinguished reputation and joins the great whale fishery, you should see the comical things he does upon reaching the seaport. In bespeaking his sea outfit, he orders bell-buttons to his waistcoats, straps to his canvas trousers. Ah, poor hayseed! How bitterly will burst those straps in the first howling gale when thou art driven, straps, buttons, and all, down the throat of the tempest. But think not that this famous town has only harpooners, cannibals, and bumpkins to show her visitors. Not at all. Still, New Bedford is a queer place. Had it not been for us whalemen, that tract of land would this day perhaps have been in as howling condition as the coast of Labrador. As it is, parts of her back country are enough to frighten one. They look so bony. The town itself is perhaps the dearest place to live in all New England. It is a land of oil, true enough, but not like Canaan, a land also of corn and wine. The streets do not run with milk, nor in the springtime do they pave them with fresh eggs. Yet, in spite of this, nowhere in all America will you find more patrician-like houses, parks and gardens more opulent, than in New Bedford. Whence came they? How planted upon this once scraggy scoria of country? Go and gaze upon the iron emblematical harpoons round yonder lofty mansion, and your question will be answered. Yes, all these brave houses and flowery gardens came from the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. One and all, they were harpooned and dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea. Can Herr Alexander perform a feat like that? In New Bedford, fathers, they say, give whales for dowers to their daughters, and portion off their nieces with a few porpoises apiece. You must go to New Bedford to see a brilliant wedding, for, they say, they have reservoirs of oil in every house, and every night recklessly burn their lengths in spermaceti candles. In summertime the town is sweet to see, full of fine maples, long avenues of green and gold, and in August high in air, the beautiful and bountiful horse chestnuts, candelabra-wise, proffer the passer-by their tapering upright cones of congregated blossoms. So omnipotent is art, which in many a district of New Bedford has superinduced bright terraces of flowers upon the barren refuse rocks, thrown aside at creation's final day. And the women of New Bedford, they bloom like their own red roses. But roses only bloom in summer, whereas the fine carnation of their cheeks is perennial as sunlight in the seventh heavens. Elsewhere match that bloom of theirs ye cannot, save in Salem, where they tell me the young girls breathe such musk, their sailor sweethearts smell them miles offshore. as though they were drawing nigh the odorous Moluccas instead of the puritanic sands. Chapter 7. The Chapel. In this same New Bedford there stands a whaleman's chapel, and few are the moody fishermen, shortly bound for the Indian Ocean or Pacific, who fail to make a Sunday visit to the spot. I am sure that I did not. Returning from my first morning stroll, I again sallied out upon this special errand. The sky had changed from clear, sunny cold to driving sleet and mist. Wrapping myself in my shaggy jacket of the cloth called bearskin, I fought my way against the stubborn storm. Entering, I found a small, scattered congregation of sailors and sailors' wives and widows. A muffled silence reigned, only broken at times by the shrieks of the storm. Each silent worshipper seemed purposely sitting apart from the other, as if each silent grief were insular and incommunicable. The chaplain had not yet arrived, and there were these silent islands of men and women, sat steadfastly eyeing several marble tablets with black borders, masoned into the wall on either side of the pulpit. 3 of them ran something like the following, but I do not pretend to quote. Sacred to the memory of John Talbot, who, at the age of 18, was lost overboard, near the Isle of Desolation off Patagonia, November 1st, 1836. This tablet is erected to his memory by his sister. Sacred to the memory of Robert Long, Willis Ellery, Nathan Coleman, Walter Canny, Seth Macy, and Samuel Gleig, forming one of the boat's crews of the ship Eliza, who were towed out of sight by a whale, on the offshore ground in the Pacific, December 31st, 1839. This marble is here placed by their surviving shipmates. Sacred to the memory of the late Captain Ezekiel Hardy, who in the bows of his boat was killed by a sperm whale on the coast of Japan, August 3rd, 1833. This tablet is erected to his memory by his widow. Shaking off the sleet from my ice-glazed hat and jacket, I seated myself near the door, and turning sideways was surprised to see Queequeg near me. Affected by the solemnity of the scene, there was a wandering gaze of incredulous curiosity in his countenance. This savage was the only person present who seemed to notice my entrance, because he was the only one who could not read, and therefore was not reading those frigid inscriptions on the wall. Whether any of the relatives of the seamen whose names appeared there were now among the congregation, I knew not. But so many are the unrecorded accidents in the fishery, and so plainly did several women present wear the countenance, if not the trappings, of some unceasing grief, that I felt that here before me were assembled those in whose unhealing hearts the sight of those bleak tablets sympathetically caused the old wounds to bleed afresh. Oh, ye whose dead lie buried beneath the green grass, who standing among flowers can say, Here, here lies my beloved, ye know not the desolation that broods in bosoms like these? What bitter blanks in those black-bordered marbles which cover no ashes? What despair in those immovable inscriptions? What deadly voids and unbidden infidelities in the lines that seem to gnaw upon all faith, and refuse resurrections to the beings who have placelessly perished without a grave? As well might those tablets stand in the cave of Elephanta as here. In what census of living creatures the dead of mankind are included? Why it is that a universal proverb says of them, that they tell no tales, though containing more secrets than the Goodwin sands. How it is that to his name who yesterday departed for the other world we prefix so significant an infidel a word, and yet do not thus entitle him, if he but embarks for the remotest Indies of this living earth. Why the life insurance companies pay death forfeitures upon immortals? In what eternal, unstirring paralysis and deadly, hopeless trance yet lies antique Adam, who died 60 round centuries ago? How it is that we still refuse to be comforted for those, who we nevertheless maintain our dwelling in unspeakable bliss? Why all the living so strive to hush all the dead? Wherefore but the rumor of a knocking in a tomb will terrify a whole city? All these things are not without their meanings, but faith, like a jackal, feeds among the tombs, and even from these dead doubts she gathers her most vital hope. It need scarcely be told with what feelings on the eve of a Nantucket voyage I regarded those marble tablets, and by the murky light of that dark and doleful day read the fate of the whaleman who had gone before me. Yes, Ishmael, the same fate may be thine, but somehow I grew merry again. Delightful inducements to embark, fine chance for promotion, it seems. Aye, a stove-boat will make me an immortal by brevet. Yes, there is death in this business of whaling, a speechlessly quick chaotic bundling of a man into eternity, but what then? Methinks we have hugely mistaken this matter of life and death. Methinks that what they call my shadow here on earth is my true substance. Methinks that in looking at things spiritual, we are too much like oysters, observing the sun through the water, and thinking that thick water the thinnest of air. Methinks my body is but the lees of my better being. In fact, take my body who will. Take it, I say, it is not me. And therefore 3 cheers for Nantucket, and come a stove-boat, and stove-body when they will, for stave my soul, Jove himself cannot. Chapter 8. The Pulpit. I had not been seated very long ere a man of a certain venerable robustness entered. Immediately, as the storm-pelted door flew back upon admitting him, a quick regardful eyeing of him by all the congregation sufficiently attested that this fine old man was the chaplain. Yes, it was the famous Father Mapple, so called by the whalemen, among whom he was a very great favorite. He had been a sailor and a harpooner in his youth, but for many years past had dedicated his life to the ministry. At the time I now write of, Father Mapple was in the hardy winter of a healthy old age, that sort of old age which seems merging into a second flowering youth, for among all the fissures of his wrinkles, there shone certain mild gleams of a newly developing bloom, the spring verdure peeping forth even beneath February's snow. No one having previously heard his history could for the first time behold Father Mapple without the utmost interest, because there were certain engrafted clerical peculiarities about him, imputable to that adventurous maritime life he had led. When he entered, I observed that he carried no umbrella, and certainly had not come in his carriage, for his tarpaulin hat ran down with melting sleet, and his great pilot-cloth jacket seemed almost to drag him to the floor with the weight of the water it had absorbed. However, hat and coat and overshoes were one by one removed, and hung up in a little space in an adjacent corner. When arrayed in a decent suit, he quietly approached the pulpit. Like most old-fashioned pulpits, it was a very lofty one, and since irregular stairs to such a height would, by its long angle with the floor, seriously contract the already small area of the chapel, the architect, it seemed, had acted upon the hint of Father Mapple, and finished the pulpit without a stairs, substituting a perpendicular side ladder, like those used in mounting a ship from a boat at sea. The wife of a whaling captain had provided the chapel with a handsome pair of red worsted man-ropes for this ladder, which, being itself nicely headed, and stained with a mahogany color, the whole contrivance, considering what manner of chapel it was, seemed by no means in bad taste. Halting for an instant at the foot of the ladder, and with both hands grasping the ornamental knobs of the man-ropes, Father Mapple cast a look upwards, and then, with a truly sailor-like, but still reverential dexterity, hand over hand, mounted the steps as if ascending the main-top of his vessel. The perpendicular parts of this side ladder, as is usually the case with swinging ones, were of cloth-covered rope, only the rounds were of wood, so that at every step there was a joint. At my first glimpse of the pulpit, it had not escaped me that, however convenient for a ship, these joints in the present instance seemed unnecessary, for I was not prepared to see Father Mapple, after gaining the height, slowly turn round and, stooping over the pulpit, deliberately drag up the ladder step by step, till the whole was deposited within, leaving him impregnable in his little Queequeg. I pondered some time without fully comprehending the reason for this. Father Maple enjoyed such a wide reputation for sincerity and sanctity that I could not suspect him of courting notoriety by any mere tricks of the stage. No, thought I, there must be some sober reason for this thing. Furthermore, it must symbolize something unseen. Can it be, then, that by that act of physical isolation, he signifies his spiritual withdrawal for the time from all outward worldly ties and connections? Yes, for replenished with the meat and wine of the word, to the faithful man of God, this pulpit I see is a self-containing stronghold, a lofty Aaron Brightstein, with a perennial well of water within the walls. But the side ladder was not the only strange feature of the place, borrowed from the chaplain's former seafarings. Between the marble cenotaphs on either hand of the pulpit, the wall which formed its back was adorned with a large painting representing a gallant ship beating against a terrible storm off a lee coast of black rocks and snowy breakers. But high above the flying scud and dark rolling clouds, there floated a little isle of sunlight, from which beamed forth an angel's face, and this bright face shed a distinct spot of radiance upon the ship's tossed deck, something like that silver plate now inserted into the Victory's plank where Nelson fell. Ah, noble ship, the angel seemed to say, beat on, thou noble ship, and bear a hardy helm, for lo, the sun is breaking through, the clouds are rolling off, serenest azure is at hand. Nor was the pulpit itself without a trace of the same sea taste that had achieved the ladder and the picture. Its panelled front was in the likeness of a ship's bluff bows, and the Holy Bible rested on a projecting piece of scroll-work, fashioned after a ship's fiddle-headed beak. What could be more full of meaning? For the pulpit is ever this earth's foremost part. All the rest comes in its rear. The pulpit leads the world. From thence it is the storm of God's quick wrath is first descried, and the bow must bear the earliest brunt. From thence it is the God of breezes, fair or foul, is first invoked for favorable winds. Yes, the world's a ship on its passage out, and not a voyage complete, and the pulpit is its prow. Chapter 9. The Sermon. Father Maple rose, and in a mild voice of unassuming authority ordered the scattered people to condense. Starboard gangway there, side away to larboard, larboard gangway to starboard, midships, midships. There was a low rumbling of heavy sea boots among the benches, and a still slighter shuffling of women's shoes, and all was quiet again, and every eye on the preacher. He paused a little, then kneeling in the pulpit's bows, folded his large brown hands across his chest, uplifted his closed eyes, and offered a prayer so deeply devout that he seemed kneeling and praying at the bottom of the sea. This ended in prolonged solemn tones, like the continual tolling of a bell in a ship that is foundering at sea in a fog. In such tones he commenced reading the following hymn, but changing his manner towards the concluding stanzas, burst forth with appealing exultation and joy. The ribs and terrors in the whale arched over me a dismal gloom, while all God's sunlit waves rolled by, and lift me deepening down to doom. I saw the opening maw of hell, with endless pains and sorrows there, which none but they that feel can tell. Oh, I was plunging to despair. In black distress I called my God, when I could scarce believe him mine. He bowed his ear to my complaints, no more the whale did me confine. With speed he flew to my relief, as on a radiant dolphin borne. Awful, yet bright, as lightning shone the face of my deliverer God. My song forever shall record that terrible, that joyful hour. I give the glory to my God, his all the mercy and the power. Nearly all joined in singing this hymn, which swelled high above the howling of the storm. A brief pause ensued. The preacher slowly turned over the leaves of the Bible, and at last, folding his hand down upon the proper page, said, "Beloved shipmates, clinch the last verse of the first chapter of Jonah. And God had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Shipmates, this book, containing only 4 chapters, 4 yarns, is one of the smallest strands in the mighty cable of the Scriptures. Yet, what depths of the soul does Jonah's deep sea line sound? What a pregnant lesson to us is this prophet! What a noble thing is that canticle in the fish's belly! How billow-like and boisterously grand! We feel the floods surging over us. We sound with him to the kelpy bottom of the waters. Seaweed and all the slime of the sea is about us. But what is this lesson that the book of Jonah teaches? Shipmates, it is a 2-stranded lesson, a lesson to us all as sinful men, and a lesson to me as a pilot of the living God. As sinful men, it is a lesson to us all, because it is a story of the sin, hard-heartedness, suddenly awakened fears, the swift punishment, repentance, prayers, and finally the deliverance and joy of Jonah. As with all sinners among men, the sin of this son of Amittai was in his willful disobedience of the command of God. Never mind now what that command was, or how conveyed which he found a hard command, but all the things that God would have us do are hard for us to do. Remember that, and hence he oftener commands us than endeavors to persuade. And if we obey God, we must disobey ourselves, and it is in this disobeying ourselves wherein the hardness of obeying God consists. With this sin of disobedience in him, Jonah still further flouts at God by seeking to flee from him. He thinks that a ship made by men will carry him into countries where God does not reign, but only the captains of this earth. He skulks about the wharves of Joppa, and seeks a ship that's bound for Tarshish. There lurks, perhaps, a hitherto unheeded meaning here. By all accounts, Tarshish could have been no other city than the modern Cadiz. That's the opinion of learned men. And where is Cadiz, shipmates? Cadiz is in Spain, as far by water from Joppa as Jonah could possibly have sailed in those ancient days, when the Atlantic was an almost unknown sea, because Joppa, the modern Jaffa, shipmates, is on the most easterly coast of the Mediterranean, the Syrian, and Tarshish or Cadiz, more than 2,000 miles to the westward from that, just outside the Straits of Gibraltar. See ye not then, shipmates, that Jonah sought to flee worldwide from God? Miserable man! Oh, most contemptible and worthy of all scorn, with slouched hat and guilty eye, skulking from his God, prowling among the shipping like a vile burglar hastening to cross the seas. So disordered, self-condemning is his look, that had there been policemen in those days, Jonah, on the mere suspicion of something wrong, had been arrested ere he touched a deck. How plainly he's a fugitive! No baggage, not a hat-box, valise, or carpet-bag. No friends accompany him to the wharf with their adieu. At last, after much dodging search, he finds the Tarshish ship receiving the last items of her cargo, and as he steps on board to see its captain in the cabin, all the sailors for the moment desist from hoisting in the goods to mark the stranger's evil eye. Jonah sees this, but in vain he tries to look all ease and confidence. In vain essays his wretched smile. Strong intuitions of the man assure the mariners he can be no innocent. In their gamesome but still serious way, one whispers to the other, "Jack, he's robbed a widow," or "Joe, do you mark him? He's a bigamist," or "Harry lad, I guess he's the adulterer that broke jail in old Gomorrah," or belike, "one of the missing murderers from Sodom." Another runs to read the bill that's stuck against the spile upon the wharf to which the ship is moored, offering 500 gold coins for the apprehension of a parricide, and containing a description of his person. He reads and looks from Jonah to the bill, while all his sympathetic shipmates now crowd round Jonah, prepared to lay their hands upon him. Frighted, Jonah trembles, and summoning all his boldness to his face, only looks so much the more a coward. He will not confess himself suspected, but that itself is strong suspicion. So he makes the best of it, and when the sailors find him not to be the man that is advertised, they let him pass, and he descends into the cabin. "Who's there?" cries the captain at his busy desk, hurriedly making out his papers for the customs. "Who's there?" Oh, how that harmless question mangles Jonah. For the instant he almost turns to flee again, but he rallies. "I seek a passage in this ship to Tarshish. How soon sail ye, sir?" Thus far the busy captain had not looked up to Jonah, though the man now stands before him, but no sooner does he hear that hollow voice than he darts a scrutinizing glance. "We sail with the next coming tide," at last he slowly answered, still intently eyeing him. "No sooner, sir." "Soon enough for any honest man that goes a passenger." "Ha, Jonah, that's another stab." But he swiftly calls away the captain from that scent. "I'll sail with ye," he says. "The passage money, how much is that? I'll pay now." For it is particularly written, shipmates, as if it were a thing not to be overlooked in this history, that he paid the fare thereof, ere the craft did sail. And taken with the context, this is full of meaning. Now Jonah's captain, shipmates, was one whose discernment detects crime in any, but whose cupidity exposes it only in the penniless. In this world, shipmates, sin that pays its way can travel freely, and without a passport, whereas virtue of a pauper is stopped at all frontiers. So Jonah's captain prepares to test the length of Jonah's purse, ere he judge him openly. He charges him thrice the usual sum, and it's assented to. Then the captain knows that Jonah is a fugitive, but at the same time resolves to help a flight that paves its rear with gold. Yet when Jonah fairly takes out his purse, prudent suspicion still molests the captain. He rings every coin to find a counterfeit. "Not a forger, anyway," he mutters, and Jonah is put down for his passage. "Point out my stateroom, sir," says Jonah now. "I'm travel-weary. I need to sleep." "Thou lookest like it," says the captain. "There's thy room." Jonah enters and would lock the door, but the lock contains no key. Hearing him foolishly fumbling there, the captain laughs lowly to himself and mutters something about the doors of convicts' cells being never allowed to be locked within. All dressed and dusty as he is, Jonah throws himself into his berth and finds the little stateroom ceiling almost resting on his forehead. The air is close, and Jonah gasps. Then in that contracted hole, sunk too beneath the ship's waterline, Jonah feels the heralding presentiment of that stifling hour when the whale shall hold him in the smallest of his bowels wards. Screwed at its axis against the side, a swinging lamp slightly oscillates in Jonah's room, and the ship, heeling over towards the wharf with the weight of the last bales received, the lamp, flame and all, though in slight motion, still maintains a permanent obliquity with reference to the room, though in truth infallibly straight itself, it but made obvious the false lying levels among which it hung. The lamp alarms and frightens Jonah, as lying in his berth his tormented eyes roll round the place, and this thus far successful fugitive finds no refuge for his restless glance. But that contradiction in the lamp more and more appalls him. The floor, the ceiling, and the side are all awry. "Oh, so my conscience hangs in me," he groans. "Straight upwards, so it burns. But the chambers of my soul are all in crookedness, like one who after a night of drunken revelry hies to his bed, still reeling, but with conscience yet pricking him, as the plungings of the Roman racehorse, but so much the more strike his steel tags into him. as one who in that miserable plight still turns and turns in giddy anguish, praying God for annihilation until the fit be past, and at last, amid the whirl of woe, he feels a deep stupor steals over him, and as over the man who bleeds to death, for conscience is the wound, and there's naught to staunch it, so, after sore wrestlings in his birth, Jonah's prodigy of ponderous misery drags him drowning down to sleep. And now the time of tide has come. The ship casts off her cables, and from the deserted wharf the uncheered ship for Tarshish, all careening, glides to sea. That ship, my friends, was the first of recorded smugglers. The contraband was Jonah. But the sea rebels, he will not bear the wicked burden. A dreadful storm comes on, the ship is like to break. But now when the boatswain calls all hands to lighten her, when boxes, bales, and jars are clattering overboard, when the wind is shrieking and the men are yelling, and every plank thunders with trampling feet right over Jonah's head, in all this raging tumult, Jonah sleeps his hideous sleep. He sees no black sky and raging sea, feels not the reeling timbers, and little hears he or heeds he the far rush of the mighty whale, which even now with open mouth is cleaving the seas after him. Aye, shipmates, Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, a berth in the cabin as I have taken it, and was fast asleep. But the frightened master comes to him and shrieks in his dead ear, "What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise!" Startled from his lethargy by that direful cry, Jonah staggers to his feet, and stumbling to the deck, grasps a shroud, to look out upon the sea. But at that moment he is sprung upon by a panther billow leaping over the bulwarks. Wave after wave thus leaps into the ship, and finding no speedy vent, runs roaring fore and aft, till the mariners come nigh to drowning while yet afloat. And ever as the white moon shows her affrighted face from the steep gullies in the blackness overhead, aghast Jonah sees the rearing bowsprit pointing high upward, but soon beat downward again towards the tormented deep. Terrors upon terrors run shouting through his soul. In all his cringing attitudes, the god-fugitive is now too plainly known. The sailors mark him, more and more certain grow their suspicions of him, and at last, fully to test the truth by referring the whole matter to high heaven, they fall to casting lots, to see for whose cause this great tempest was upon them. The lot is Jonah's. That discovered, then how furiously they mob him with their questions. What is thine occupation? Whence comest thou? Thy country? What people? But mark now, my shipmates, the behavior of poor Jonah. The eager mariners but ask him who he is, and where from, whereas they not only receive an answer to those questions, but likewise another answer to a question not put by them, but the unsolicited answer is forced from Jonah by the hard hand of God that is upon him. "I am Hebrew," he cries, and then, "I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who hath made the sea and the dry land." Fear him, O Jonah! Aye, well mightest thou fear the Lord God then. Straightway he now goes on to make a full confession, whereupon the mariners became more and more appalled, but still are pitiful. For when Jonah, not yet supplicating God for mercy, since he but too well knew the darkness of his deserts, when wretched Jonah cries out to them to take him and cast him forth into the sea, for he knew that for his sake this greatest tempest was upon them, they mercifully turn from him and seek by other means to save the ship. But all in vain. The indignant gale howls louder. Then with one hand raised invokingly to God, with the other they not unreluctantly lay hold of Jonah. And now behold Jonah taken up as an anchor and dropped into the sea, when instantly an oily calmness floats out from the east. And the sea is still as Jonah carries down the gale with him, leaving smooth water behind. He goes down in the whirling heart of such a masterless commotion that he scarce heeds the moment when he drops seething into the yawning jaws awaiting him. And the whale shoots, to all his ivory teeth, like so many white bolts, upon his prison. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord out of the fish's belly. But observe his prayer and learn a weighty lesson. For sinful as he is, Jonah does not weep and wail for direct deliverance. He feels that his dreadful punishment is just. He leaves all his deliverance to God, contenting himself with this, that spite of all his pains and pangs, he will still look towards his holy temple, and here, shipmates, is true and faithful repentance, not clamorous for pardon, but grateful for punishment. And how pleasing to God was this conduct in Jonah, is shown in the eventual deliverance of him from the sea and the whale. Shipmates, I do not place Jonah before you to be copied for his sin, but I do place him before you as a model for repentance. Sin not, but if you do, take heed to repent of it like Jonah. While he was speaking these words, the howling of the shrieking, slanting storm without seemed to add new power to the preacher, who, when describing Jonah's sea storm, seemed tossed by a storm himself. His deep chest heaved as with a ground swell, his tossed arms seemed the warring elements at work, and the thunders that rolled away from off his swarthy brow, and the light leaping from his eye, made all his simple hearers look on him with a quick fear that was strange to them. There now came a lull in his look, as he silently turned over the leaves of the book once more, and at last, standing motionless with closed eyes, for the moment, seemed communing with God and himself. But again he leaned over towards the people, and bowing his head lowly, with an aspect of the deepest yet manliest humility, he spake these words, Shipmates, God has laid but one hand upon you. Both his hands press upon me. I have read ye, by what murky light may be mine, the lesson that Jonah teaches for all sinners. And therefore to ye, and still more to me, for I am a greater sinner than ye, and now how gladly would I come down from this masthead, and sit on the hatches there where you sit, and listen as you listen, while someone of you reads me that other and more awful lesson which Jonah teaches to me, as a pilot of the living God, how being an anointed pilot prophet, or speaker of true things, and bidden by the Lord to sound those unwelcome truths in the ears of a wicked Nineveh, Jonah, appalled at the hostility he should raise, fled from his mission, and sought to escape his duty and his God by taking ship at Joppa. But God is everywhere. Tarshish he never reached. As we have seen, God came upon him in the whale, and swallowed him down to living gulfs of doom, and with swift slantings tore him along into the midst of the seas, where the eddying depths sucked him 10,000 fathoms down, and the weeds were wrapped about his head, and all the watery world of woe bowled over him. Yet even then, beyond the reach of any plummet, out of the belly of hell, when the whale grounded upon the ocean's utmost bones, even then God heard the engulfed, repenting prophet when he cried. Then God spake unto the fish, and from the shuddering cold and blackness of the sea, the whale came reaching up towards the warm and pleasant sun, and all the delights of air and earth, and vomited out Jonah upon the dry land. When the word of the Lord came a second time, and Jonah, bruised and beaten, his ears like two seashells, still multitudinously murmuring of the ocean, Jonah did the Almighty's bidding. And what was that, shipmates? To preach the truth to the face of falsehood. That was it. This, shipmates, this is that other lesson, and woe to that pilot of the living God who slights it. Woe to him whom this world charms from gospel duty. Woe to him who seeks to pour oil upon the waters when God has brewed them into a gale. Woe to him who seeks to please rather than to appall. Woe to him whose good name is more to him than goodness. Woe to him who, in this world, courts not dishonor. Woe to him who would not be true, even though to be false were salvation. Yea, woe to him who, as the great pilot Paul has it, while preaching to others is himself a castaway. He dropped and fell away from himself for a moment, then lifting his face to them again, showed a deep joy in his eyes as he cried out with a heavenly enthusiasm, "But oh, shipmates, on the starboard hand of every woe, there is a sure delight, and higher the top of that delight than the bottom of the woe is deep. Is not the main truck higher than the kelson is low? Delight is to him a far, far upward and inward delight. Who against the proud gods and commodores of this earth ever stands forth his own inexorable self? Delight is to him whose strong arms yet support him, when the ship of this base treacherous world has gone down beneath him. Delight is to him who gives no quarter in the truth, and kills, burns, and destroys all sin, though he pluck it out from under the robes of senators and judges. Delight, topgallant delight is to him, who acknowledges no law or lord, but the Lord his God, and is only a patriot to heaven. Delight is to him whom all the waves of the billows of the seas of the boisterous mob can never shake from this sure keel of the ages, and eternal delight and deliciousness will be his, who coming to lay him down can say with his final breath, O Father, chiefly known to me by thy rod, mortal or immortal, here I die. I have striven to be thine more than to be this world's or mine own. Yet this is nothing. I leave eternity to thee. For what is man that he should live out the lifetime of his God? He said no more, but slowly waving a benediction, covered his face with his hands, and so remained kneeling till all the people had departed, and he was left alone in the place. Chapter 10. A Bosom Friend. Returning to the Spouter Inn from the chapel, I found Queequeg there quite alone, he having left the chapel before the benediction some time. He was sitting on a bench before the fire, with his feet on the stove hearth, and in one hand was holding close up to his face that little negro idol of his, peering hard into its face, and with a jackknife gently whittling away at its nose, meanwhile humming to himself in his heathenish way. But being now interrupted, he put up the image, and pretty soon, going to the table, took up a large book there, and placing it on his lap, began counting the pages with deliberate regularity. At every 50th page, as I fancied, stopping a moment, looking vacantly around him, and giving utterance to a long-drawn, gurgling whistle of astonishment, he would then begin again at the next 50, seeming to commence at number 1 each time, as though he could not count more than 50, and it was only by such a large number of 50s being found together that his astonishment at the multitude of pages was excited. With much interest I sat watching him, savage though he was, and hideously marred about the face, at least to my taste. His countenance yet had a something in it, which was by no means disagreeable. You cannot hide the soul. Through all his unearthly tattooings, I thought I saw the traces of a simple, honest heart, and in his large, deep eyes, fiery black and bold, there seemed tokens of a spirit that would dare 1,000 devils. And besides all this, there was a certain lofty bearing about the pagan, which even his uncouthness could not altogether maim. He looked like a man who had never cringed and never had had a creditor. Whether it was, too, that his head being shaved, his forehead was drawn out in freer and brighter relief, and looked more expansive than it otherwise would, this I will not venture to decide, but certain it was his head was phrenologically an excellent one. It may seem ridiculous, but it reminded me of General Washington's head, as seen in the popular busts of him. It had the same long, regularly graded, retreating slope from above the brows, which were likewise very projecting, like 2 long promontories, thickly wooded on top. Queequeg was George Washington cannibalistically developed. Whilst I was thus closely scanning him, half pretending meanwhile to be looking out at the storm from the casement, he never heeded my presence, never troubled himself with so much as a single glance, but appeared wholly occupied with counting the pages of the marvellous book. Considering how sociably we had been sleeping together the night previous, and especially considering the affectionate arm I had found thrown over me upon waking in the morning, I thought this indifference of his very strange. But savages are strange beings. At times you do not know exactly how to take them. At first they are overawing. Their calm self-collectedness of simplicity seems a Socratic wisdom. I had also noticed that Queequeg never consorted at all, or but very little, with the other seamen in the inn. He made no advances whatever, appeared to have no desire to enlarge the circle of his acquaintances. All this struck me as mighty singular. Yet, upon second thoughts, there was something almost sublime in it. Here was a man, some 20,000 miles from home, by the way of Cape Horn, that is, which was the only way he could get there, thrown among people as strange to him as though he were in the planet Jupiter, and yet he seemed entirely at his ease, preserving the utmost serenity, content with his own companionship, always equal to himself. Surely this was a touch of fine philosophy, though no doubt he had never heard there was such a thing as that. But perhaps, to be true philosophers, we mortals should not be conscious of so living or so striving. So soon as I hear that such or such a man gives himself out for a philosopher, I conclude that, like the dyspeptic old woman, he must have broken his digester. As I sat there in that now lonely room, the fire burning low in that mild stage when, after its first intensity has warmed the air, it then only glows to be looked at, the evening shades and phantoms gathering round the casements, and peering in upon us silent, solitary twain, the storm booming without in solemn swells, I began to be sensible of strange feelings. I felt a melting in me. No more my splintered heart and maddened hand were turned against the wolfish world. This soothing savage had redeemed it. There he sat, his very indifference speaking a nature in which there lurked no civilized hypocrisies and bland deceits. Wild he was, a very sight of sights to see. Yet I began to feel myself mysteriously drawn towards him, and those same things that would have repelled most others, they were the very magnets that thus drew me. I'll try a pagan friend, thought I, since Christian kindness has proved but hollow courtesy. I drew my bench near him, and made some friendly signs and hints, doing my best to talk with him meanwhile. At first he little noticed these advances, but presently upon my referring to his last night's hospitalities, he made out to ask me whether we were again to be bedfellows. I told him yes, whereat I thought he looked pleased, perhaps a little complimented. We then turned over the book together, and I endeavored to explain to him the purpose of the printing, and the meaning of the few pictures that were in it. Thus I soon engaged his interest, and from that we went to jabbering the best we could about the various outer sights to be seen in this famous town. Soon I proposed a social smoke, and producing his pouch and tomahawk, he quietly offered me a puff, and then we sat, exchanging puffs from that wild pipe of his, and keeping it regularly passing between us. If there yet lurked any ice of indifference towards me in the pagan's breast, this pleasant genial smoke we had soon thawed it out, and left us cronies. He seemed to take to me quite as naturally and unbiddenly as I to him, and when our smoke was over, he pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me round the waist, and said that henceforth we were married, meaning, in his country's phrase, that we were bosom friends. He would gladly die for me, if need should be. In a countryman, this sudden flame of friendship would have seemed far too premature, a thing to be much distrusted. But in this simple savage, these old rules would not apply. After supper, and another social chat and smoke, we went to our room together. He made me a present of his embalmed head, took out his enormous tobacco wallet, and groping under the tobacco drew out some $30 in silver. Then spreading them on the table, and mechanically dividing them into 2 equal portions, pushed one of them towards me and said it was mine. I was going to remonstrate, but he silenced me by pouring them into my trousers pockets. I let them stay. He then went about his evening prayers, took out his idol and removed the paper fireboard. By certain signs and symptoms, I thought he seemed anxious for me to join him, but well knowing what was to follow, I deliberated a moment whether, in case he invited me, I would comply or otherwise. I was a good Christian, born and bred in the bosom of the infallible Presbyterian Church. How then could I unite with this wild idolater in worshipping his piece of wood? But what is worship, thought I? Do you suppose now, Ishmael, that the magnanimous God of heaven and earth, pagans and all included, can possibly be jealous of an insignificant bit of black wood? Impossible! But what is worship? To do the will of God. That is worship. But what is the will of God? To do to my fellow man what I would have my fellow man do to me. That is the will of God. Now Queequeg is my fellow man, and what do I wish that this Queequeg would do to me? Why, unite with me in my particular Presbyterian form of worship. Consequently, I must then unite with him in his, ergo, I must turn idolater. So I kindled the shavings, helped prop up the innocent little idol, offered him burnt biscuit with Queequeg, salaamed before him twice or thrice, kissed his nose, and that done, we undressed and went to bed, at peace with our own consciences and all the world. But we did not go to sleep without some little chat. How it is, I know not. But there is no place like a bed for confidential disclosures between friends. Man and wife, they say, there open the very bottom of their souls to each other, and some old couples often lie and chat over old times till nearly morning. Thus, then, in our heart's honeymoon, lay I and Queequeg, a cozy, loving pair. Wow, we have a lot to unpack here. And speaking of unpacking, when we do the analysis portion, would you guys prefer chapter by chapter or an episode overview where it's more summarized? I would love to know, so please comment, send me a message, let me know, because I want to make this as great an experience as I can for everybody. I am so sorry this is late. I've been taken out by the weather. When people tell you, oh, the weather doesn't affect your health, yes it does. And I'm not talking about sundowning. I'm talking about literal pressure on my brain. I have been literally I've been on a ride, guys. It has been a very, very rough week. And it's gonna get better someday. It's gotta, right? So, back to episode 2, chapters 4 through 10. So, earlier this episode, we learned about the importance of religion during the time in which Melville lived. I'm sure that you drew some parallels from what we discussed earlier to some of what these chapters went over, because he uses many biblical names and terms. He even created some of his own words like Tongatabuers, and I still can't say that well, but he made it up. But his story is genuinely influenced by religion in the life, you know, how it's so central to their lives, by how he describes people's attitudes and their interactions. And what's so interesting is, instead of being so rigid in we must convert people in order to be saved, instead of being so rigid with, you have to be Christian in order to be saved. Instead, you see Ishmael in chapter 10, Bosom Friends, where he's actually struggling with, what do I do when he's presented with the option of worshiping with Queequeg? You know, because back then, normally it would be, nope, we're not doing this, it's not going to be a thing, we are not worshiping your idol, you are going to come with us to our church, you are going to dress a certain way, you're going to do this so that we can save your soul, and so that I can get more brownie points for heaven. And instead of having that outlook, that belief, which was so core to their lives back then, Melville took a different route. And it's probably because of some of his background for why he did it this way. And again, we're going to get more into Melville later. I just figured that religion was the best time to talk about it, where we literally had chapters based off of a church and a sermon. But instead of sticking to the strict Christian values and upbringing that he had Ishmael analyze the situation, and he had this great dilemma, this great debate where he was literally searching within himself, what do I do here? What is worship? What is devotion? What would God want me to do? What is the will of God? And he literally goes through all of this over and over. And then he realizes the will of God is love. And what is worship? What is, he starts being philosophical and analyzing religion in what manner that was not common in these days. And he comes to the conclusion that God wants him to do unto his fellow man what he would like done unto him. And he examines that. He looks at it and he's like, well, what would I want Queequeg to do with me? Well, I would want him to go to church and worship at my church with me. And if I ever would expect this of Queequeg, why am I not doing the same? This is what we should be doing, is reciprocating. And so he comes to the conclusion that it is not sacrilegious to worship with Queequeg, because he's still going to be going to the correct place, to heaven, to all of it afterward, if there even is a heaven, because he's got doubts. But Queequeg, in his ways, in what they consider to be heathen ways, he's seeing that there's all this good that is actually more important than some of the Christian values that he'd been growing up with. Because instead of it being, we must save you in order to save ourselves, Queequeg sees a person as who they are and treats them well, treats them the way that he would want to be treated. And he's like, you know what? I want to be more like that. And so they worship the idol together, which is huge. It's so progressive for the time, and it says a lot even for today's day and age, because we're still fighting wars over religion. We're still going and disagreeing with people just because they have a different belief system than our own, instead of looking beyond and realizing that when you get to the core of your beliefs, love is the core of your beliefs, and to treat everyone the way that you want to be treated. I mean, it's really beautiful how a book that was written over 100 years ago can still pertain to today. I mean, in another facet, it's kind of sad that we're still fighting with this, but I'm hoping that learning and hearing it can help people to move forward. I know that for me, when I first read it as a young child, because again, I was a nerd and I was like 12, might have been younger, I got in a lot of trouble, okay? I did way too much reading. If any of my teachers are on here, they can attest. Like, drop a comment about what a nightmare I was to try to teach anything that wasn't in a book. Well, and by book, I mean things that weren't on the reading list. Things I shouldn't have even been reading at my age. But, I was not your typical kid. And so when I read that, I was like, yes, it resonated deep within me. Because I do firmly believe that in order for people to move forward and live good lives, we are to treat each other well, that there is underlying good in everybody. I mean, modern days really do have me questioning this core belief, but it would still be nice that if this genuinely existed. Something else that he exhibits here is not only is he, going deep within religion, but he is showing that Ishmael is truly going past Queequeg's exterior to recognize the humanity and the integrity underneath. This is huge, because when you think about the 1800s, you don't think of the most open-minded people. These are people where if you didn't look the same, didn't talk the same, didn't act the same, you were a pariah. You were not okay. You were not somebody that they could accept. And yet Melville, because of his experiences, he made a character who could overlook all these things that were fundamentally pounded within themselves. And that's huge. In chapter 5, Ishmael meets other whalers, these other boarders, at the house where they're staying. And he is genuinely surprised because these men, instead of having these exciting stories about whaling, about their lives, the danger, the life they've led, they're all quiet. Even Queequeg is quiet. And he describes them as sheepish, because you wouldn't expect it, because they have such a fierce reputation. And it's important to note this when you are looking at this book, because back then, whalers and sailors weren't considered in the best light. They were a very rough bunch. And rather than portray into that stigma, he went ahead and he put it down in the way that he'd experienced the sailors. because a lot of people just assumed that they were just going to be this rough and rowdy bunch. And they had their moments, don't get me wrong. But a lot of them at their core, they were quiet, they kept to themselves. It wasn't something that they wanted to brag about. It's almost like they were soldiers going to war. I don't know about you, but every soldier in my life has, they're not proud of what they've done. They don't just go and they talk about it. They've had to do things that they never thought they would have to do, and it pushed them beyond their limits. And it is a parallel that we can draw with our sailors and our whalers for this. In fact, this silence that they have, it signifies this unspoken understanding of these men who face death at sea every single day. It isn't something that they want to brag about. It isn't something that they want to share with the world, to scream from the hilltops, you know? It's something that they keep to themselves. It is their private. It is their truth. And yeah, in Breakfast, they describe Queequeg a little eccentrically, you know, where he's using his harpoon to get the food. But what I want you to focus on with that specific chapter is when Ishmael is observing Queequeg, he describes him as having a genteel countenance, a genteel aura about him, an air about him. And he contrasts that with the restrained, polite behavior of the other sailors. You know, this is one of those where he's contrasting again society's views with what they consider to be a savage cannibal, and he's seeing that Queequeg wasn't that. He's seeing that there's much more to him. And when he goes out and he's exploring New Bedford, it allows him to expand his horizons even more, to expand his understanding more. And what I mean is New Bedford was literally a town that was built upon whaling. Whaling had such a huge impact on New Bedford, from the economy, the diversity of the community, the way that they lived their lives in general. And what I mean by the diversity of the community is he goes out on his walk and he sees a street with what they would consider to be normal people, and then there's all these people who are like Queequeg, where you would think that they were these savage people. They're not, but he sees them on the street, interacting with everyone else, living their day to day. I mean, he's seeing people from all around the known world here, and he's realizing that it isn't such an uncommon occurrence, that it is commonplace, and these people belong within society. And it's huge because it's literally stretching his belief system in that way. And at the same time, he's also seeing what he calls country dandies. And I love that Melville throws this in here, because Ishmael is literally having a laugh at these gentlemen who are considered well off in the countryside coming to, you know, pursue whaling or another sailing venture. And they're not prepared. They don't dress properly. They don't act correctly. They are very green. They are very wet behind the ears. They have no idea what's about to come to them. And it's important to note this because this is life or death. When you live the life, it is life or death. And he sees, you know, all of these different kinds of people, and he realizes that this is more of what society should be. And it stretches his understanding. In that way, Melville was trying to stretch the people of his time, stretch them as well. It wasn't just, oh, Ishmael came to this understanding. It was Melville was trying to create more of an exposure for people who would never see this kind of a thing. People who would only see it in books. And he was trying to create this exposure. And New Bedford was an excellent place for him to base this, because the city really was so diverse, so dynamic within the whaling world. And whaling had such a huge influence upon New Bedford. They describe this town as being very wealthy because of whaling. They have all these grand homes and gardens, which you don't see in a lot of these towns or island cities. You don't see that. But because of whaling, they have all this richness to it. And he even goes as far as to describe the weddings as being very grand affairs, where they are burning whale oil and spermaceti candles all through the day and night. Do you have any idea how expensive that was back then? Probably not, but if you take your electric bill and you compound it by like 10, you have an inkling of how much they were spending on just one day of celebration. And that's just aspects of it. That's not even the whole day. It's probably closer to 20 times if you look at the entire amount of things that they did to celebrate weddings back then. When he discusses the chapel, like, I know we've already talked about religion, but it's important to discuss that the atmosphere there was very somber. He goes into this chapel and you just see grieving families and memorial tablets everywhere. And this helps to set the tone. It helps to foreshadow what is to come, that this journey isn't going to be something fun and exciting. I mean, it's exciting, don't get me wrong, but there's tragedy, there is loss, there is pain coming. And Melville was really heavily foreshadowing. And even then, he's got Ishmael questioning the dread that he experiences about his own mortality, and how he then shifts it to this defiance that his soul is his own and therefore indestructible. Like, no matter what is going to happen, he will get through it, which is really important because it sets the tone for the story. And he surprises you with having Queequeg there. And when you meet Father Mapple and he does his sermon, he talks about Jonah denying God and his sin of not preaching the truth and running away. It's so important to look at this because not only are we discussing that, but we're also discussing that the pulpit is the prow of the ship to lead the way through life's stormy voyage. He's relaying that life and being on a ship, that the sea is tied to spirituality yet again. And when you are looking at these contrasts between everything that he has going on, it's truly foreshadows the upcoming journey. Like Father Mapple against Ahab. I mean, you have this strong, calm man who is trying to lead his flock to salvation, who's trying to help bring you through the storm to success. And then you have Ahab, who is blasphemous. He is so blinded by his anger, by his need for revenge, that it doesn't matter who gets in his way. He is going to get what he wants. And that is all he cares about. Back to talking about Jonah and Father Maple's sermon, he says, and I quote, "Sin that pays its way can travel freely. Virtue, if a pauper, is stopped at all frontiers." And I thought this was a very important thing to examine because this is still true today. If you look at it, people can do very bad things and get away with them when they're rich, when they can afford it. Whereas you could come in with good intentions and be trying to improve life for all mankind, and you are going to be stopped at the door if you don't have the money to pay for it. And I think that it's an important thing to look at because we should be working more together as humanity. I don't understand why we have to keep putting all these divisions in place when we all want the same thing. We've got to look at it from this viewpoint. And this is from 1851, guys. And this viewpoint was here even then. We need to learn from the past in order to, A, avoid repeating history, and so that we can move forward, make new mistakes, and hopefully make a lot of really great advancements. And when Father Mapple is doing his sermon, he talks about Jonah being sinful, and when he was swallowed up by the whale, that Jonah didn't weep and wail for deliverance. He considered his punishment to be just, and he left that deliverance to God. And so, yes, he did pray. Yes, he did reach out to God, but it wasn't a save me, save me. He considered his punishment with it to be swallowed by the whale to be just. And because, as they describe it, it was a true and faithful repentance where he was grateful for his punishment, then he was delivered. That's important to look at because when you go and you look at what's going to happen later in our story, there's a lot that happens. And this parallel is actually drawn later, which is why I bring it up so heavily. I promise we're not going to focus on religion forever and ever. It's just this particular section, it makes the most sense. After the sermon, after the benediction, Ishmael, he becomes really great close friends with Queequeg. He is drawn to Queequeg, to his simple, honest heart, and they end up sharing the pipe and bonding. And yes, there is the phrase, pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me round the waist, and said that henceforth we were married, meaning in his country's phrase that we were bosom friends, that Queequeg would die for Ishmael. That is a very important thing to look at because, again, this explains some of what's going to be happening in our story. It also, if you recall from episode 1, I called Melville the king of convoluted. Well, there has been questions based off of phrases such as this in Moby Dick and some of his other works, and letters that he wrote to other people, to like Nathaniel Hawthorne and to family members, that make you wonder, was he bisexual? Was he gay? Again, we will never probably know the truth, and we will examine this more in depth when we actually discuss Melville's life. But it's important to look at because back then, they did approach male friendships differently. You were able to say some of these things that today you're like, and could be borderline offensive because you're like, I don't know what this person's sexuality is. I don't know if they want more from me. Because there's a lot more lines, a lot more things that are blurred today. And that's okay, because love is love. But what I want you to focus on here is there are going to be some moments where you're like, and yes, they did talk that way. They would be like, this is my bosom friend. We hugged, we did this, we kissed, we did X, Y, or Z. And it was the way that they were. They weren't necessarily gay. I mean, it truly existed back then. I know a lot of people are in denial, but it's part of life. You love who you love. You are attracted to whom you are attracted to. And that is okay. I still find it to be very fascinating because the way that history has been, they try to eradicate a lot of things where it could possibly be misconstrued. Or if the author literally was. And so again, there could be some long-lost letter where he's declaring his love to someone, we just haven't found it. Or it was destroyed, but we don't know. And that is, again, okay. But the important thing here is that Ishmael and Queequeg, they form this important bond that is going to literally last the story. It sets the tale, because here is where Queequeg and Ishmael, they divide the goods, they worship, they're confidential with each other. They are going to be very close throughout this story. And we all need a really good friend like that. We all need a ride or die, someone that we can rely on no matter what. I know that in the way of today's world, that things are just so fast, and the internet, and we all lose sight of what's important. And, we really need to get back to the basics, to our roots. Like, yes, this is a wonderful tool. But that doesn't mean that it takes away from the importance of having these friendships. And Melville was literally just making groundbreaking decisions with the way that he wrote his book, because he is having this important friendship forged between his sailor, his main character Ishmael, and a man that the world would consider heathen, savage, unfit, inferior. And he has it so they go beyond that to form a very important friendship. And honestly, it is a beautiful thing, and it was something that was very much needed. This probably created some of the flop for what occurred with Moby Dick, to be perfectly honest. But it was groundbreaking. This helped to start paving the way for what was to come. Because if you remember, this book came out before we had our Civil War, before we abolished slavery. While Melville was never vocal about slavery must be abolished, this must happen, this must go away, in his own way, if you read his stories, if you read his books, he's got little things in here where he's already past that point where he believes that these people are just as important as the rest of us. They are valued members of the community. We just need to look past the surface to see the good underneath. And I feel that is so wonderful to see, because you don't see it. I mean, when you read parts of Moby Dick, you're over here like, he said, what? And, he wasn't being the problem. He was definitely a product of his environment, of his upbringing, of the time. But he was, at the same time, he was also trying to get past that. He was trying to help stretch people's beliefs so that they could be could more readily accept others, and that is so important. And I apologize, I could probably talk about this all day long. Well, actually I can't, my head hurts. But I apologize if you guys find this to be very fascinating, and here I am cutting it short. But if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please send me a message, drop a comment, say something. I will literally include it in our next episode or address it in a private message to you. I'm very interactive. I want this to be something where we can all learn and grow. And I apologize, but again, the weather has been kicking my trash from going from rain to snow, back to rain, and oh look, is that hail? It's really kicking my trash. But before we go, don't forget that I have a Patreon. Follow me on there or hit that like button so you can find me again later, and we will talk again soon. Bye!